She stood outside her own husband's gate, holding an ultrasound photo in her trembling hand, the only proof she had that he still had a reason to love her. But the gate didn't open, and the man inside, the man she had sworn to love until death, was walking another woman through their front door. That night, she vanished, and when he finally learned the truth, it was too late to apologize, but not too late to bleed for it. If you want to know what happens next, stay until the end, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The storm had been building since noon. By the time Vivian Hale turned onto the private road leading to the Morrow estate, the rain was coming down sideways, the kind that doesn't just soak you, but punishes you, like the sky itself has a grudge. Her windshield wipers were losing the fight. The headlights barely cut 10 feet into the dark. She had been driving for 40 minutes through weather that should have made her pull over, park somewhere warm, and wait until morning. She didn't stop. She couldn't. She pressed her left hand flat against her coat pocket. Through the fabric, she could feel the folded edge of the ultrasound photo. Stiff, slightly damp from where the corner had caught the rain when she'd rushed from the clinic to her car. 8 weeks. The technician had said it with a tired smile, like it was just a number, just a routine measurement, just another Tuesday afternoon. But for Vivian, those 2 words had cracked something open in her chest that she hadn't felt in years, something that felt almost like hope. She hated that she still had hope. She hated it the way you hate a bad habit you can't quit. Adrian Morrow was not a man who inspired hope. He was a man who inspired caution, the kind of quiet, suffocating caution that seeps into your daily life until you stop reaching for things, stop expecting phone calls to be returned, stop waiting up. Vivian had learned this slowly, the way you learn that a stove burner is still hot, even when the coil has gone dark. You don't learn it from a warning, you learn it from the burn. But this was different. This was a child. His child. She told herself that changed things. She needed to believe it changed things. The iron gate of the estate materialized through the rain, massive, black, geometric, like something designed not to keep the world out but to remind it that it wasn't welcome. 2 guards stood in the booth beside it, dry and bored, the orange tip of a cigarette visible through the smeared glass. Vivian slowed the car and rolled her window down. Rain immediately lashed against the side of her face. "I need to see my husband," she said. Water ran into her mouth when she spoke. The guard nearest the window, a thick man with a jaw like a concrete block, didn't even look up from his phone. Mr. Morrow left specific instructions. No unannounced visitors. That includes family. "I'm not a visitor. I'm his wife." "I know who you are, Mrs. Morrow." He said the name like it tasted wrong in his mouth. "My instructions don't change." Vivian stared at him. She had learned a long time ago that arguing with Adrian's men was pointless. They weren't paid to have opinions. They were paid to hold a line, and they held it the way rocks hold a shoreline, completely, indifferently, without apology. But she looked past the guard's shoulder, past the gate, up the long curve of the driveway toward the lit windows of the main house, and that's when she saw them. 2 silhouettes, close together, moving across the far window of the study, the room with the floor-to-ceiling glass that Adrian had always refused to curtain because he liked to see the grounds at night. He had told her once it made him feel like he owned not just the house, but everything the light touched. One silhouette was Adrian. She knew his shape the way she knew her own reflection. The set of his shoulders, the unhurried way he moved, like he was never rushing because the world rearranged itself to accommodate his pace. The other silhouette was a woman, shorter, darker hair. And she was not standing at a professional distance. Vivian watched them cross the window and disappear into the interior of the house. She did not make a sound. She was very deliberate about that. She pressed her lips together and she breathed through her nose, and she kept her face completely still while something inside her chest quietly came apart at the seams. "Mrs. Morrow." The guard's voice had shifted just slightly. Not softer, but more careful, the way people speak when they're watching someone absorb something terrible and they don't want to be responsible for what happens next. "You should go." She went. She rolled the window up. She turned the car around. She drove back down the private road in the rain, and she did not cry, because crying felt like the wrong response to something this particular flavor of devastating. Crying was for grief. What she was feeling was more like the moment before grief, That hollow, suspended second when you understand exactly what has happened, but your body hasn't caught up yet to the full weight of it. The ultrasound photo sat in her pocket. She drove. She had made it maybe 4 miles down the main highway when her phone started. A notification first. A text from an unknown number. She glanced at it at a red light. The screen read, "Turn back now, you are not safe." She stared at it. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She almost called Adrian. She almost did. But she thought about that silhouette, and she put the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove through the red light. The second message came 3 minutes later. Same number. "They have been watching you. Do not stop the car." She checked her mirrors. Darkness and rain and the broken yellow line of the highway reflecting back at her. Nothing behind her. Nothing ahead. She was completely alone on a road that connected the Morrow estate to the outer edge of the city, 12 miles of nothing. Industrial land on both sides, chain link fencing, abandoned infrastructure, the kind of stretch that exists in every city but that nobody ever talks about because it's the part that development forgot. Her engine died at mile 7. It didn't sputter or cough or give her any warning. 1 second it was running. The next second, complete silence except for the rain hammering the roof of the car. The dashboard went dark. The headlights cut out. She was coasting on momentum in total blackness, and she had just enough time to steer onto the gravel shoulder before the car rolled to a full stop. She sat there in the dark and listened to the rain. Her phone was dead too. She hadn't noticed. She reached for it, and the screen was black, wouldn't respond to the button, wouldn't charge, wouldn't do anything. She didn't understand how that was possible. She had left the house with 83% battery. She remembered the number specifically because she had checked it right before getting in the car, the way she always did since the time she'd broken down outside the city 2 years ago and been stranded with 4% battery and had needed Adrian's driver to come find her. Adrian's driver? She almost laughed at that, as if she could call Adrian's driver right now. She grabbed the door handle and pushed it open. The rain hit her like a physical thing. She stepped out into it, and immediately her shoes sank into the soft gravel shoulder, and the cold went through her coat, through her sweater, down into her skin within about 4 seconds. She looked up and down the highway. No headlights in either direction. She looked at the tree line on the opposite side of the road. Dense, black, the trees moving in the wind like they were breathing. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. She turned around. He came out of the dark from the direction of her car's rear bumper. A man in dark clothing with something over his face, moving toward her with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. He was large. Not in an exaggerated way, just solid. The kind of build that tells you immediately that physical resistance is going to be expensive. "Get in the car," he said. Not aggressive. Flat. Like he was reading a script he'd memorized. "That's my car," Vivian said, because her mouth said things before her brain could organize them into something smarter. "I know." He kept moving toward her. "Get in." She ran. She made the decision in the half second before he was close enough to grab her, and she went left, away from the highway and toward the fence line, because the fence line was dark and she understood instinctively that darkness was her only advantage. She heard him behind her, footsteps on wet gravel turning to footsteps on wet grass as she hit the embankment and scrambled up it. She cleared the fence where it had rusted and bent low, tearing the hem of her coat on a spur of metal, and she hit the tree line at a dead run. The wood swallowed her. She ran until she couldn't hear footsteps behind her. She ran until her lungs were burning and her feet couldn't feel the ground properly, and she had no idea which direction she was facing. She ran until a root caught her ankle and put her down hard onto the forest floor, hands out, face almost hitting the mud. She lay there for a second, just breathing. The rain was quieter in here, filtered through the canopy, reduced from a roar to a hiss. She could hear her own heartbeat louder than the wind. She pressed the ultrasound photo against her chest through the coat, and she lay on the cold forest floor, and she breathed and tried to think. Nobody was coming, not Adrian, not his men. She had driven away from the gate and not told anyone where she was going, which had seemed at the time like dignity, and now felt like the dumbest decision she had ever made. She got up. She started moving, slowly, in what she hoped was a direction that would eventually lead to a road or a light, or something that was not just trees and rain and dark. She was soaked through. Her hands had started to shake. Not from fear, she told herself, but from cold, because that distinction felt important right now. Behind her, somewhere back near the highway, she heard a car door close. Then nothing. She kept moving. Adrian Morrow did not sleep that night. Not because he felt guilty. Guilt wasn't something Adrian experienced the way most people did. It was more that he had a low-grade awareness, a persistent background signal that something had been wrong about the evening, and he couldn't locate the source of the wrongness. He had told himself it was business. He had told himself it was the Voss situation, the loose ends, the unfinished accounting that kept accumulating the way interest does when you ignore a debt too long. He had poured 3 fingers of whiskey and sat in the same study where the floor-to-ceiling windows looked out onto the dark, wet grounds, and he had not been able to sit still. Celine had gone to one of the guest rooms without pushing him on it. She was smart that way. Smart enough to understand that Adrian Morrow was not a man you pushed, and perceptive enough to know that tonight he was somewhere else inside his head. She had touched his arm at the bottom of the stairs and said goodnight, and he had barely registered it. He was on his second glass when Marcus, his head of security, knocked twice on the study door and opened it without waiting. That was protocol. 2 knocks meant something that couldn't wait. "We've got a situation," Marcus said. Adrian looked at him over the rim of his glass. Define situation. A car was found abandoned on the Harwick stretch, highway between here and the city, mile marker 7. Marcus paused, just a beat, the way Marcus did when he was organizing information that he knew was going to land badly. "It's registered to Vivian." The glass didn't move. Adrian's face didn't change, but something happened behind his eyes, a rapid, involuntary recalculation, the kind that happens when a fact you weren't expecting enters your understanding of a situation and reshapes everything around it. His wife's car. Mile marker 7 on the Harwick stretch, which meant she had been out here tonight, which meant she had come to the estate. "The gate," he said. She was turned away at approximately 11:40 p.m. Adrian set the glass down on the windowsill very carefully. "On my orders." "Yes, sir." He said nothing for several seconds. Outside, the rain was finally starting to ease, but the grounds were dark and wet, and the distant fence line was invisible in the black. He had looked through this window tonight and felt like he owned everything the light touched. Right now, he looked through it and felt the particular hollowness of a man who has made a decision he cannot unmake. "Have you reached her?" "Her phone is unreachable. Goes straight to dead. Not voicemail. Dead. Like the device is powered off or destroyed." "Get teams on the Harwick stretch. Full sweep. I want to know every vehicle that was on that road between 11 p.m. and now. I want the car impounded and gone through." Adrian turned away from the window. "And I want to know who turned her away and exactly what they said to her." Marcus was already on his radio. Adrian walked out of the study, down the corridor, and into the attached garage, where 3 vehicles were parked and ready. He didn't call anyone. He didn't put on a jacket. He got into the closest car in the clothes he'd been wearing all evening and drove himself out to the Harwick stretch in the gray hour before dawn, because there was a part of him, a part he would never have admitted to anyone, that needed to see it himself. Vivian's car was exactly where Marcus had said. Driver's door still closed, passenger window smashed inward, glass on the seat, the interior lights dead, the whole vehicle sitting on the gravel shoulder like a discarded thing. He stood in the rain looking at the broken window for a long time. Then his phone rang. It was Marcus. "Sir, we found something inside the vehicle, in the seat pocket behind the driver's seat." A pause. "It's a photograph. Medical image. Looks like an ultrasound." The rain hit Adrian's face and ran down into the collar of his shirt, and he didn't move. He stood on the gravel shoulder of the Harwick stretch with the shattered passenger window of his wife's car 3 feet in front of him, and he held the phone against his ear, and he did not speak for so long that Marcus said his name twice. "Sir, you still there?" "I'm here," Adrian said. His voice was completely level. That was the thing about Adrian Morrow. The worse the situation, the more still he became. It was what made him dangerous. It was what had made him everything he was. Stillness where other men unraveled. But inside that stillness, something was happening that he had no vocabulary for. 8 weeks. He didn't know the number yet, but he understood immediately what the image meant. She had come here tonight not to fight, not to accuse, not to deliver an ultimatum. She had come here to tell him something that would have changed every calculation he'd made about his life. And he had left her standing in the rain at his own gate, and then someone had smashed her window and taken her into the dark. "Get me Ren," he said. Ren was the best tracker he had. "Get me every piece of footage from every camera within 4 miles of this location. And find out who sent her the text messages. Yes, I know about them. I'll explain later. Right now, I need answers in the next 2 hours." He hung up. He looked at the broken window one more time. Then he turned and walked back to his car with the specific, measured stride of a man who has made a decision so complete and so final that there is nothing left to deliberate, only to execute. Somewhere out in the dark woods beyond the tree line, something moved, a branch displaced, a sound too deliberate to be wind. Adrian stopped walking and looked toward the trees. Nothing, just rain and shadow and the distant sound of his own men arriving on the highway behind him. He got in the car. He didn't know yet that the text messages on Vivian's phone had been sent from a device registered to a shell company. A shell company that traced back through 4 layers of deliberate misdirection to a name he had hoped he would never have to hear again. He didn't know that the man who had approached Vivian on the highway had been watching the estate for 11 days. He didn't know that the woman he'd walked through his front door that evening had a different last name than the one she'd given him. He didn't know any of it yet, but by the time the sun came up over the Harwick stretch and turned the wet asphalt orange and gold, Adrian Morrow would begin pulling the first thread, and what unraveled from it would drag him into a war he thought he'd already finished, against enemies he thought he'd already buried. For a woman he had failed in every way a man can fail someone he loves. And somewhere in those woods, Vivian was still moving, still breathing, still holding the ultrasound photo against her chest in the cold and the dark. One hand pressed over the thing she had come to tell him, the thing that nobody knew, the thing that was now the only reason she refused to stop walking. She didn't know whether he would come for her. She didn't know whether she even wanted him to. But she kept moving anyway. The sun came up ugly. It came up the way mornings do after a bad storm. Not clean, not clear, but gray and waterlogged. The sky the color of a bruise fading at the edges. The Harwick stretch was lit up with headlights by the time the forensics team arrived. 3 vehicles parked at aggressive angles on the gravel shoulder, doors open, radios going. Adrian stood apart from all of it with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and watched them process his wife's car like it was evidence of something he wasn't ready to name yet. Marcus came to stand beside him without being called. That was one of the things Adrian had kept Marcus around for. The man understood proximity, knew when to approach and when to hold back. 15 years of working for Adrian Morrow had calibrated him precisely. Wren's team swept the tree line as far as the creek bed, Marcus said. They found tracks, woman's shoe size, moving northeast away from the highway. How far in? Half a mile, maybe? Then the ground got too soft. Rain took the rest. Adrian didn't say anything. He looked at the tree line, dark even now in the thin morning light, the trees packed close and indifferent. She was running, Marcus said. I know she was running. Adrian's voice was quiet, not angry. The kind of quiet that lives on the other side of anger, in the place where decisions get made without emotion contaminating them. What about the window? Smashed from the outside, tempered glass so it shattered inward onto the seat. Whoever did it used something blunt. We're thinking a tactical baton or similar. Not random, deliberate. 1 strike, right positioning. Marcus paused. This wasn't opportunistic, sir. Somebody knew she was going to be on this road. They knew she was going to be turned away at the gate. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus didn't respond to that. There was nothing to say to it that wouldn't make it worse. One of the forensics men was lifting the ultrasound photo from the evidence bag and placing it inside a clear sleeve. Adrian watched him do it from across the gravel, and something moved behind his eyes. Not grief. Not yet. But its predecessor. The thing that comes before grief when you're a man who has trained yourself not to feel things in sequence. Get me the phone records, Adrian said. All of them. Every text she received last night, every call she made, every tower her phone pinged before it went dark. And I want to know who she saw at whatever clinic gave her that image. Already on it. And Marcus. Adrian finally turned to look at him. The woman who came to the house last night, Celine. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Just slightly, the way a man's posture shifts when he's receiving information he already suspected was coming. What about her? I want to know everything about her that I don't already know, and I want it before noon. Marcus left without another word. Adrian stood on the gravel shoulder until the forensics team finished. He stood there until the tow truck arrived and took Vivian's car away, and left nothing but a patch of compressed gravel and a scattering of broken glass catching the pale light. He stood there until his phone started ringing with calls he didn't answer. He stood there thinking about the last real conversation he and Vivian actually had, words that meant something, and trying to remember when it was. He couldn't. That was the part that stayed with him as he finally got back in his car. He couldn't remember the last time he had sat across from his wife and heard what she was actually saying. He drove back to the estate with his hands tight on the wheel and his mind moving through the problem the way it always moved through problems. Cold, systematic, without sentiment. But underneath the system, something else was running. Something he kept trying to push back below the surface, and it kept rising. She had an ultrasound in her coat pocket. She had driven through a storm to show him. She had stood at his gate in the rain, and he had left her there. The estate looked different in daylight after a storm. The grounds were wet and dark. The gravel of the front drive pocked with puddles. Adrian pulled into the garage and sat in the car for 30 seconds, doing nothing before he got out. He walked into the main house through the side entrance, bypassed the kitchen where two of the household staff were moving with the careful energy of people who know something is wrong but haven't been told what, and went directly to his office on the second floor. The office was where he thought, not the study. The study was where he presented himself. The office was where the real machinery of his life operated. 2 monitors, a phone system, a wall of physical files, and a gun that lived in the second drawer on the right side of the desk. He sat down, opened the laptop, and started working through what Marcus had already uploaded to the secure drive. The phone records came through first. Vivian's call log from the previous night was 42 minutes long. Not because she'd made calls that lasted that long, but because there were 14 unanswered calls to his number in the space of about an hour, starting from approximately the time she would have been turning away from the gate. He scrolled through them and did not look away. He made himself look at every timestamp. He had been sitting 20 feet from his phone all evening. He had seen her name on the screen. He had let it go. He had let it go 14 times. He closed the call log and opened the text thread from the unknown number. 2 messages, both time-stamped after she had left the gate. Turn back now. You are not safe. Then, 3 minutes later, they have been watching you. Do not stop the car. The number had already been traced. It bounced through a relay in the city's East District and terminated at a prepaid device purchased 4 days ago with cash from a convenience store on Marsh Street. The store's camera was conveniently non-functional. 4 days ago. Someone had purchased that phone 4 days ago, which meant this had been in planning at least that long, which meant someone had known 4 days ago that Vivian would be on that road. Adrian leaned back in his chair. The only way someone could know Vivian would be on that road was if they had known she was going to try to come to the estate, which meant they had either been monitoring Vivian's movements, monitoring his estate, or both. And the only way the timing could be that precise, adjusted for the specific night she appeared, was if someone had known about the gate order, his direct instruction to deny her entry. That was an internal leak. He was still sitting with that thought when his door opened without a knock. He looked up. Celine Voss stood in the doorway in different clothes than the previous evening. She'd helped herself to something from one of the guest closets, a gray sweater, dark slacks, and she was holding a cup of coffee in both hands like it was something she needed to do with her fingers. I heard, she said, close the door. She came in and closed it behind her. She didn't sit down. She seemed to sense that sitting down would be the wrong instinct right now. She stood near the bookcase on the far wall and looked at him with an expression he'd spent several weeks interpreting as composed intelligence, and which he was now looking at with entirely different eyes. Your wife, she said. I'm sorry. Is there any— How long have you known who I am? Adrian said. The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Celine's fingers moved on the coffee cup, just a small adjustment of grip. But he'd been watching people's hands his entire professional life, and he caught it. I don't know what you mean, she said. Then I'll be specific. He opened a file on his desk and turned the laptop around to face her. On the screen was a photograph, extracted from a facial recognition pass that Marcus had run at 4 a.m. Celine, younger, at an event, standing beside a man named Conrad Voss. Your last name isn't Carver. She looked at the photograph. She looked at it for what a person might call a moment too long. Then she looked at him, and something shifted in her face. Not a collapse, nothing that theatrical. More like a mask being placed on a table. Carefully. Deliberately. You're thorough, she said. Who sent you? It's not that simple. It never is. Adrian stood up from behind the desk. He didn't reach for the second drawer. Didn't need to, and they both knew it. He just stood up, which in a room this size, with a man built like Adrian Morrow, was sufficient. My wife is missing. There's an ultrasound photo sitting in an evidence bag downstairs that tells me she was pregnant and came to this house last night to tell me that. And instead, she's in a forest somewhere because someone used her specifically, precisely, to get to me. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Son. Celine set the coffee cup down on the edge of the bookcase with a steadiness that impressed him even now. My brother, she said. Piers, he planned this. Adrian absorbed that. Piers Voss, the younger of the two surviving Voss siblings, the one who'd gone quiet after Adrian had dismantled the family's operation 2 years prior. Too quiet, in retrospect, the kind of quiet that turns out to be preparation rather than surrender. You're here as what? Adrian said. Insurance, a distraction? Both. She said it without flinching. He needed you occupied for one evening. He needed to know your movements, your schedule, whether you had additional security posted, whether your wife would be a viable... She stopped. Say the word. Her jaw tightened. Whether she would be a viable target. The room went very still. Adrian looked at her for a long time without speaking. Outside the window, he could hear his men moving on the grounds, radios going, boots on wet gravel. Where is she? He said. I don't know the location. That's the truth. Piers wouldn't have given me that. He knew that if anything went wrong with my side of it, I'd be sitting exactly here. Then what do you know? I know it's not random. They're not going to hurt her immediately. That's not the point. The point is you. They want you to spend time looking. They want you to feel it. Adrian walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the grounds. His hands were at his sides, completely still. Why? He said, though he already knew. You don't spend 15 years building an empire on the bones of other people's empires without accumulating a list. But he wanted to hear her say it. Your operation against the Voss network cost my family everything, Celine said. My father died in custody 8 months after you handed the feds what they needed. My mother, she's not relevant, but Piers has been building toward this for 2 years. This isn't about money or territory. It's personal. It always is. He turned back around. He looked at Celine Voss and he made a decision in the way that he made all his significant decisions. Quickly, completely, without second-guessing once the variables were clear. You're going to help me find her, he said. And if I don't, then I stop being polite. She held his gaze. He gave her credit for that. Most people didn't. And if I do? Then I remember that you told me what you told me when you didn't have to. It wasn't a promise of safety. It wasn't a guarantee of anything. But it was the best she was going to get, and they both understood that. She gave a small nod. Adrian picked up his phone and called Marcus. Get the team together, full roster, and bring Ren inside. I need him running active analysis, not field work. He paused. And nobody leaves this property without my explicit clearance. Not staff, not contractors, nobody. He hung up and looked at Celine. Start talking. She talked. She talked for 40 minutes, seated finally in the chair across from his desk, laying out what she knew of Piers's operation, the infrastructure, the manpower, the financial backing that had come from new partnerships Piers had built while everyone assumed he was finished. She talked about the surveillance of the Morrow estate, which had begun 6 months ago. She talked about the inside contact. Not who, not yet, she was holding that, she said, as something she'd trade for a specific condition she'd name later. And she talked about the methodology, watching Vivian, learning her patterns, identifying the window. Adrian listened without interrupting. He had a legal pad in front of him, and he wrote things down the old-fashioned way, longhand, because he thought better with a pen in his hand. By the time she finished, he had filled 4 pages. The inside contact was the critical thread. Someone in his household had known about the gate order and passed it to Piers's people in time to position the man on the Harwick stretch. That meant someone who had been in the room, or close enough to the room, when Adrian had given the instruction. He thought back through the previous evening, the sequence, the people present. There were 4 possibilities. He circled a name on the legal pad and then sat looking at it. Marcus appeared in the doorway. Sir, we've got something. Adrian got up. The something was footage, pulled from a traffic camera on the outer edge of the Harwick corridor, one of 3 cameras on that stretch that were technically the city's infrastructure, but whose feeds Adrian's operation had maintained unauthorized access to for years, specifically because the Harwick stretch was the primary artery between his estate and the city, and he liked knowing what moved on it. The footage showed a dark van, no plates, moving northeast on the highway at 12:08 a.m. The timestamp placed it on the road within 20 minutes of Vivian abandoning her car. The van slowed near mile marker 7, visible on the footage only as a brief deceleration, barely 3 seconds, before accelerating again and disappearing toward the industrial district. They picked her up, Ren said. He was a lean man with a quiet way of speaking, the kind of person you'd walk past in a grocery store and forget immediately, which was exactly why Adrian had hired him. Or they tried to. We don't know if she was in the vehicle at that point or still in the woods. If she was still in the woods, she has been out there for 8 hours in wet conditions with no phone and no shelter, Adrian said. Yes, sir. Have we swept the area beyond the creek bed? Expanding the sweep now, but sir, the van. Wren pulled up a second image, an enhancement of the footage. There's a partial plate visible in one frame, rear right corner. We ran it. He paused. The plate is registered to a company called Harrow Logistics. The company's address is a commercial unit in the East District. The unit was leased 8 months ago. 8 months ago. The same time frame Celine had given for the beginning of the surveillance. Adrian looked at the address. He looked at it the way he looked at targets. How many men do we have available right now who can move without drawing attention? Wren and Marcus exchanged a look. 6, Marcus said. Maybe 8 if we pull from the secondary rotation. Get 8 armed, plainclothes vehicles that don't trace back to us. Adrian picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. We're going to Harrow Logistics. Sir, if they have her there, they don't have her there. That's a base of operations, not a holding location. He buttoned the jacket. But it'll tell us where the holding location is. He was halfway to the door when his phone lit up. Unknown number. He stopped walking and looked at the screen. His thumb moved over the answer button and he pressed it and held the phone to his ear. Nothing for 2 seconds. Then a voice, male, unhurried, the particular vocal cadence of someone who has rehearsed being calm. Mr. Morrow, the voice said. I was wondering when you'd start answering your phone. Adrian was very still. Piers. A pause on the other end, surprised, maybe, that the identification had come so fast, but recovering quickly. I see you've had a productive morning. Tell me she's alive. She's alive. She's uncomfortable, but she's alive. That can change in either direction depending on how the next few hours go. Another pause, and this one had a different texture. Something deliberate behind it, a man placing words with the care of someone who has been planning this conversation for a long time. She's pregnant. Did you know that? 8 weeks. We found the photograph when we brought her in. Adrian's hand tightened on the phone. He didn't speak. Nothing? Piers said. No response to that? Interesting. His tone shifted. Still controlled, but warmer in a way that was worse than coldness. Let me tell you what I want, Mr. Morrow. I want you to feel exactly what my father felt when you handed him to the government. I want you to spend time not knowing. I want you to sit in that house that you built on top of what used to be my family and understand, completely, in your bones, what it costs when the people you love pay for what you've done. You want to talk about what things cost, Adrian said. His voice was completely level. We can have that conversation in person. We will, eventually. A sound on the line, movement, something shifting. I'll be in touch with instructions. Don't do anything stupid in the meantime. The people watching your estate right now will notice. The line went dead. Adrian lowered the phone. He stood in the doorway of the office and looked at the legal pad on his desk. The 4 names, one circled. And then he looked at Celine, who had been watching him through the entire call with the careful stillness of someone who is calculating odds. Your brother just called, he said. I heard. He said there are people watching the estate right now. Adrian looked at Marcus. Which means our sweep of the grounds missed someone, or someone inside is feeding them live information. He looked back at the circled name on the legal pad. Then he picked it up, tore the page off, and handed it to Marcus face down. Bring me that person, quietly. Nobody else needs to know. Marcus looked at the name on the page. His expression didn't change, but he took a long, slow breath through his nose. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything right now, Adrian said. That's the problem. Marcus left. Wren left. Adrian stood alone in the office with Celine Voss and the wreckage of an evening that had started with him refusing to open a gate and had arrived with terrible efficiency at this, his wife in unknown hands, an enemy on the phone, and a traitor somewhere inside the walls he'd spent 15 years building. He picked up the legal pad and the pen. He wrote one word at the top of a fresh page. Vivian. Then he started writing everything he knew, everything he needed to know, and every step he was going to take to bring her back, in the precise and methodical handwriting of a man who has decided that the only way through something this dark is straight ahead, regardless of the cost, regardless of what he has to become to reach the other side of it. He wrote for 6 minutes without stopping. Then his phone lit up again. This time it was Marcus, calling from somewhere inside the estate, and when Adrian answered, Marcus's voice had the texture of something breaking through the surface of professional composure for the first time in 15 years. "Sir," Marcus said, "you need to come downstairs right now. We found the inside man." Adrian set the pen down. "Who?" A silence that lasted exactly long enough to confirm what part of Adrian already knew. Had known, maybe, since he'd circled the name on the legal pad. Maybe since earlier. Maybe since the whole rotten evening had begun. "It's Danny," Marcus said. "Sir, it's Danny Reese." Danny Reese, who had been with Adrian for 11 years. Danny Reese, who had been in the room when Adrian gave the gate order. Danny Reese, who had driven Vivian to medical appointments when Adrian couldn't be bothered. Who had known her routines, her schedule, the clinic she used, the road she would take back to the estate in a storm because it was the only road she knew. Adrian walked downstairs. Danny Reese was sitting in the basement. Not restrained. Not yet. He was sitting in a metal chair in the center of the utility room beneath the east wing, the one with the concrete floor and the single overhead bulb and the drain in the middle of the floor that had never been used for anything Adrian needed to explain to anyone. Two of Marcus's men stood at the door. Danny was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped between them, and when Adrian came down the stairs and into the room, Danny looked up at him with an expression that was not guilt and not defiance, but something that lived uncomfortably between the two. The face of a man who has been caught but hasn't yet decided whether to be sorry about it. Adrian pulled a second chair from against the wall and set it down 3 feet from Danny and sat in it and said nothing. Danny was 41 years old. He had a daughter in middle school whose name was Harper, and she played soccer, and Danny had once asked Adrian for a Tuesday afternoon off to watch her play in a regional tournament, and Adrian had given it to him without question. He had a hairline that had been retreating for the past 5 years. He had a scar on his left forearm from a situation in the early days of working for Adrian that they had never discussed afterward because that was the culture. You did what you did, and you moved forward, and you didn't build monuments to it. 11 years, that was the number Adrian kept returning to. "How much did they pay you?" Adrian said. Danny's jaw moved. He looked at the floor between his feet. It wasn't about money. Then what? A long breath. "My daughter. Harper." He said her name carefully, the way you say the name of something precious in a context where it shouldn't be. "They had her for 4 hours last month, did you know that? She was walking home from practice, and they had her for 4 hours, and then they put her back on her street like nothing happened. No ransom call, no message, just proof that they could." The room was very quiet. The bulb overhead buzzed faintly. "You should have told me," Adrian said. "And what would you have done?" Danny's voice cracked on the last word, not from grief, but from the pressure of something long compressed finally finding an exit. He looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, but dry. "What would you have done, Adrian? You would have put security on her. You would have moved her. And they would have known I'd told you, and the next time it wouldn't be 4 hours. They made that very clear. So you gave them Vivian instead." The words landed into the room and stayed there. Danny flinched, a small, full-body movement, like something had struck him from the inside. He looked back at the floor. "I gave them access, the gate order, her schedule, the clinic she used. That's all." Adrian's voice stayed level. He had an extraordinary capacity for that, for keeping his voice level precisely when it should not be, and the effect it produced was worse than shouting. It made the other person feel the weight of what was being said without any of the noise that might dilute it. "You gave them her schedule, the clinic she used, the road she would take home." He paused. "She's 8 weeks pregnant, Danny. Did they tell you that? Did that information come through your hands too?" Danny put his face in his hands. "Look at me." He looked up. His face was broken open in a way that was not quite remorse and not quite shame, but something older and uglier. The specific devastation of a man who made a choice he could defend in the moment and cannot defend in retrospect. "Where are they keeping her?" Adrian said. "I don't know. I swear to you, I don't know. They never told me the operational side. I was the feed. Information going out, that's it. They compartmentalized everything." "Who did you report to?" "A man named Kale. I never had a surname. We communicated through a dead drop system, a messaging platform that self-deletes. I have the login credentials. Adrian stood up. He looked at Danny for a moment. Just looked at him, cataloging him, the way you look at something that has changed irrevocably and will never be what it was. Then he turned to Marcus at the door. Get Ren down here with a device. I want every message Danny ever sent through that platform in the next 30 minutes. He started for the stairs. He eats. Adrian. Danny's voice came from behind him. Adrian stopped but didn't turn around. I'm sorry. I know what that's worth. But I need you to know that I... Don't, Adrian said. He said it quietly, facing the stairs. Just don't. He went upstairs. He went to the kitchen, which was the room he never used for anything except passing through, and he stood at the counter and put both hands flat on the cold surface and looked at the tile and breathed. The household staff had made themselves invisible, and there was nobody in the kitchen, nobody in the corridor visible through the doorway. The estate had taken on the particular silence of a place where everyone knows something is happening and has collectively decided that visibility is a liability. 11 years. He had eaten meals across the table from Danny Reese. He had trusted him inside the estate, inside the operational layer, inside the perimeter of Vivian's daily life. And Danny had taken that trust and used it as currency with people who had used the purchase to build a trap around a pregnant woman on a storm-drenched highway. He straightened up. He went back to work. The messaging platform credentials yielded 43 exchanges between Danny and a user identified only as C. Ren worked through them in 22 minutes, pulling the metadata and reconstructing the timeline. The communication stretched back 9 months, 1 month longer than Celine had said the surveillance had been running. The first messages were introductory, careful, the testing of a possible asset. The later ones were operational. They showed, in clean and terrible detail, the gradual handing over of everything Danny knew about the Morrow household's rhythms. The final message in the chain had been sent the previous afternoon at 4:47 p.m. It contained 4 pieces of information: the gate order, Vivian's likely arrival time based on her appointment at the clinic, the condition of her vehicle's GPS tracking, which Danny had quietly disabled 2 days prior. He admitted this when Ren confronted him with the message, and a single word at the end that had no obvious operational meaning. The word was confirmed. Adrian read it twice. Then he handed the tablet back to Ren and walked to the window. Outside, his men were moving in the perimeter in the thin midday light. Professional, armed, disciplined. The infrastructure of something he had spent 15 years building, currently deployed in service of finding the woman he had spent those same 15 years failing to prioritize. He was still at the window when Celine came to find him. She moved into the room without announcing herself and stood a few feet behind him and said, "The word at the end, confirmed. Do you know what that means?" "Tell me." "It means the primary location was activated." She paused. "Piers has multiple sites prepared for this. The word was a signal that the operation had progressed to the next phase, and the primary location should be ready." Another pause, longer. "I know the primary location." Adrian turned from the window. He looked at her with the particular attention he reserved for moments where the information being offered was either the most valuable thing in the room or a weapon pointed at him dressed up as a gift. With Celine Voss at this stage, it could still be either. "You've been holding that," he said. "I told you I had something to trade. You also told me your brother compartmentalized the operational details." "He does. I'm not supposed to know." She crossed her arms. Not defensive, he had come to read her body language well enough to understand that was how she held herself when she was being precise. "But Piers and I share a history that goes beyond this operation. There was a period, before he became what he became, when he and I talked about things he shouldn't have talked about. He told me about the dockside building 2 years ago, when he first started planning, before he knew I would end up here. The dockside building, warehouse district, eastern waterfront. The building is registered to a shipping company that dissolved 18 months ago. Piers bought the lease through a third party and has been maintaining it as a contingency location for operations that required holding capacity." She met his eyes. "It has reinforced interior rooms, a generator, loading dock access to the water." She stopped. "It has the things you'd need if you were holding someone and wanted options for moving them quickly." Adrian was already moving toward the door. Marcus appeared from the corridor with the reflexive speed of a man who had been positioned just outside the room. "Sir, Harrow Logistics first. We proceed as planned. We verify the connection to the dockside location, and we confirm she's there before we move on it. I don't want to hit an empty building." Understood. And if Harrow gives us confirmation? Adrian reached the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. Then we stopped being careful. The Harrow Logistics Unit was a commercial space in a converted industrial block on the city's east side, the kind of building that had been a factory once and had been subdivided into smaller units when the factory economy died and the storage economy replaced it. Unit 14 had a corrugated steel shutter and a standard commercial lock that Wren bypassed in 4 minutes, while Adrian and 3 of his men held the alley. The unit was clean, too clean. It had been vacated recently. The floor still showed the rectangular impressions of furniture that had been removed, and there was a faint smell of electronics and fast food that spoke of people having spent significant time there. On the far wall, someone had taped a printed map to the surface. It had been partially torn down. Whoever had cleared the space had made an effort, but the lower right corner remained, attached by a single piece of tape. Wren peeled it off the wall carefully and smoothed it out. It was a section of the eastern waterfront. A building was circled in red pen. The circle had a notation beside it in handwriting Adrian didn't recognize. Primary. Confirmed capacity for 2. That's it, Celine said from behind him. Adrian turned. She had come with them against his explicit instruction, having simply gotten into the second vehicle when no one was watching. He had decided, in the car, that arguing about it was less productive than keeping eyes on her. She was looking at the map fragment. That's the building. Adrian took the map from Wren. He looked at the circled building, and then he looked at the waterfront notation in the corner. Across street, a dock number. How many men does Piers have at that location? He said to Celine. When I last had information, 12. Maybe 15, but that was 4 months ago. It'll be more now. They would have reinforced once the operation activated. He handed the map back to Wren. Get this to Marcus. I want a full tactical breakdown of that building in the next 90 minutes. Floor plan, entry points, sight lines, everything we can pull from public records and satellite. He walked out of the unit and into the alley and took out his phone. He had 2 missed calls from a number he recognized as one of the Voss operation's contact relays. Piers reaching out again through a layer of misdirection. He didn't call back. Not yet. He called Marcus instead and spoke for 4 minutes, laying out what they had, what they needed, what the timeline looked like. Marcus listened without interrupting, asked 2 specific questions about personnel capacity, and confirmed that the team could be assembled and mobile within 2 hours. When he hung up, Celine was standing at the mouth of the alley, watching him. You're going to hit it tonight, she said. I'm going to assess it tonight, then decide. You've already decided. He didn't respond to that because she was right and they both knew it, and responding would have been theater. He put the phone in his pocket and looked down the alley toward the street. A delivery truck was rolling past. Ordinary city noise, pigeons on a ledge. The world continuing its indifferent operation while inside his chest the timeline was running. Every hour Vivian spent in that building was an hour of cold, of fear, of whatever they were doing to her to maintain the psychological pressure on him. He started walking back to the vehicle. There's something else, Celine said. He stopped. Her voice had changed. Just slightly. A half-tone lower, a different texture. The voice of someone choosing whether to say the next thing, having the argument with themselves in real time. Piers called me this morning, she said, before you confronted me in the office. My phone. The secondary one. The one you don't know about. Adrian turned around slowly. She was still standing at the mouth of the alley with her arms crossed, but the composure had developed a hairline fracture, visible in the tension along her jaw, the way her eyes had stopped meeting his directly and were fixed at a point just to his left. And, he said, he told me the primary location wasn't the final location. She finally looked at him directly. He told me that if the operation moved past a certain trigger point, specifically if you began active pursuit rather than complying with the game he was running, Vivian would be moved to a secondary location that I don't know, and the terms would change. The alley was very quiet. What terms? Adrian said. He wouldn't negotiate for her return. He said at that point he would negotiate for... She stopped. Her throat moved. For the pregnancy. The words didn't fully register for a second. They registered the way a physical blow sometimes doesn't. There's the impact, and then a delayed moment before the pain arrives. And in that space between impact and pain, you're still standing, but you're not entirely sure how. He would use the pregnancy as a separate point of leverage, Adrian said. Yes. Meaning he would threaten the child specifically. Yes. Adrian looked at Celine Voss for a long moment. He looked at her the way he had looked at Danny Reese in the basement. cataloging, reassessing, recalculating the distance between who she had presented herself as and who she actually was. But this was different from Danny, because Danny had been a betrayal, and Celine was something more complicated than that. She had come into his house as an enemy operative, which he now knew, and she was standing in this alley telling him something her brother had told her in confidence, which she was choosing to do for reasons he couldn't fully map. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because I have a line." She said it flatly, not with emotion, with the particular flatness of someone who has located their limit and is describing it with clinical accuracy. "What my family lost because of you. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter. Piers has a right to his grief. He has a right to want you to feel what we felt." She paused. "He does not have a right to use an unborn child." Adrian breathed. "So the trigger point," he said, "the condition that causes them to move her and change the terms. What specifically triggers it?" "Any direct move against the primary location. Any visible mobilization of your team. If they see you coming, they move her. And the child becomes the leverage instead of her." "Yes." He looked at the wall of the alley. He looked at the brick and the graffiti and the water stain from the previous night's rain running in a long line down from a broken gutter above. He thought with extraordinary clarity and speed, the way he always thought when the variables were worst, and what he arrived at within about 40 seconds was not a solution. It was the shape of an impossible problem, which was its own kind of information. A direct assault on the primary location, which he had been building towards since sunrise, would trigger the relocation, which meant Vivian would be moved to a location he couldn't find, and the threat would shift to the pregnancy, and he would have less leverage and less information than he had right now, which was already not enough. But waiting, continuing to play the game Piers was running, showing up at false locations, burning hours while Vivian sat in a reinforced room in a waterfront building in her condition. That was its own form of damage, accumulating with every hour. He had no clean move. For the first time in 15 years of operating in a world that rewarded decisiveness, Adrian Morrow was standing in an alley with no clean move. He picked up his phone. He scrolled to the Voss contact relay number. He stared at it. His thumb hovered. Then the phone rang. Not the relay number, his own number. His personal, clean, supposedly untraceable line that almost nobody had. The screen showed unknown. He answered. "You found the map," Piers said. Not a question. His voice was warmer than it had been in the morning call, which was worse than coldness in exactly the way it was designed to be. "That was faster than I expected. You should be proud of your team. Tell me what you want." "I told you what I want. I want you to feel it." "You want something concrete. People like you always do." Adrian kept his voice level. "Name it." A pause. The sound of movement on the other end. Not Piers moving, but background movement. Multiple people. The ambient sound of an interior space with hard surfaces. A warehouse, possibly. "There's a man named Gideon Farr," Piers said. "He has information that belongs to my family. Your organization confiscated it during the operation 2 years ago. Financial records, account structures, the kind of documentation that, in the right hands, could rebuild something from nothing." Another pause. "I want it returned." "Gideon Farr is in federal custody. I know where Gideon Farr is. You have relationships with people who have access to federal custody." A beat of silence. "Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." Adrian said nothing. 24 hours, Piers said. "You arrange access to Farr and ensure the transfer of the documentation. In exchange, I return your wife to you unharmed, and we conclude our business." His voice shifted, dropping, becoming almost conversational, the tone of a man delivering the part he has been saving. "If you don't, or if I see your people moving toward any location you may have identified, then we move into the next phase of negotiations, which will involve the question of whether your child gets to be born at all." The line went dead. Adrian lowered the phone. Celine was watching him from 3 feet away. She had heard enough of it from his side to understand the shape of it. She said nothing. Adrian stood in the alley in the pale afternoon light with the phone in his hand and the map fragment in his jacket pocket, and the name Gideon Farr running through his mind, and he understood with absolute clarity that the game Piers was playing was not a negotiation, it was a dismantling. Every move available to him had been anticipated and blocked or turned into a lever for Piers to pull. The demand for Farr's documents was designed to be impossible. Not because it was actually impossible, but because fulfilling it would expose Adrian's federal connections, unravel years of carefully maintained legal insulation, and hand Piers something he could use to detonate Adrian's operation from the outside long after this situation was resolved. Piers hadn't come for a trade. Piers had come to watch him burn down everything he'd built in order to save the one person he'd never valued properly until she was gone. Adrian put the phone in his pocket. He walked to the vehicle. He got in and sat in the driver's seat and looked at the steering wheel. Ren and the others were in the second vehicle, waiting. Celine got in on the passenger side and pulled the door shut and waited. After 30 seconds of silence, Adrian started the car. "I'm not getting far," he said. "I know," Celine said, "and I'm not waiting 24 hours. She looked at him. "If we hit that building tonight," he said, "and they move her, what does Piers do with the secondary location? Does he use it for the full duration, or is it a transit point?" Celine thought about it. Transit. He's not set up for a long hold at the secondary. It's a contingency, not a base. So he moves her, but he can't hold her there indefinitely. Maybe 4-6 hours before he'd need to either return to a fixed location or make a different decision about... She stopped. "About the pregnancy," Adrian finished. He said it without flinching. He had learned in the past few hours that flinching cost time he didn't have. "So if we hit the building tonight fast enough, and we have people positioned at every viable transit route from that location, every dock, every road, every vehicle exit, you'd need to know all of them in advance. Do you know them?" A long pause, the longest she had given him. "Some of them." "Then between what you know and what my team can identify from the building's records in the next 2 hours, we build as complete a net as we can." He looked at her. "And we accept that we might not catch every thread. And we go anyway." Celine held his gaze. "If you miss one exit route, I know. If they get her to the secondary and Piers makes the call, I know." His voice was harder now, not loud but dense, the way iron is dense, heavy without effort. "I know what I'm risking. I know exactly what I'm risking." He looked through the windshield at the gray afternoon street. "But sitting still is also a risk. Every hour in that building is a risk. Every hour his people are alone with her." He paused. "I left her outside in a storm because I didn't want to be interrupted. I am not making another decision by choosing comfort over action." The car was quiet. Then Adrian put it in drive and pulled out of the alley, and behind them the second vehicle followed, and the afternoon moved around them with its ordinary noise, and inside the car the silence had the quality of a decision being sealed. Irreversible, total, the point beyond which a man cannot step back and claim he didn't know what he was choosing. He drove, and somewhere in the waterfront building, in a reinforced room with a generator humming through the wall, Vivian Hale sat on a concrete floor with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes open in the dark, and she counted her breaths the way she had read somewhere you were supposed to do, and she did not let herself think about whether the door was ever going to open, because thinking about that was how you stopped functioning, and she had decided, with the particular ferocity of someone who has no other tools available, that she was not going to stop functioning. She pressed one hand flat against her abdomen. She breathed. She waited. The tactical breakdown of the waterfront building took 91 minutes. Ren pulled everything available. Commercial satellite imagery, decommissioned Port Authority, floor plans from when the building had been a functioning cold storage facility, utility records showing active power draws that confirmed the generator Celine had mentioned, and 3 years of street-level photography from a mapping service that had last updated the block 8 months ago. He spread it across the desk in the estate's operations room and built a picture of the target the way a surgeon builds a picture of a body before cutting into it, methodically, without rushing, because the cost of missing something at this stage was paid later in a currency nobody wanted to spend. Adrian stood over the desk and did not rush him. The building had 4 entry points. Loading dock on the water side, so large, accessible, the obvious approach, and therefore the most heavily watched. 2 standard doors on the street-facing side, north and south ends of the building, and a service access on the eastern wall, partially obscured by a neighboring structure that appeared in the original Port Authority plans but had been built over in a renovation sometime in the past decade. Whether that access still existed behind the newer exterior was unknown. "If the service access is still there," Ren said, tapping the eastern wall on the plan, "it's our cleanest point of entry, covered from sightlines on 3 sides. The neighboring structure gives us approach cover for the last 40 feet. And if it's not there," Marcus said, "then we're committed to a 2-point breach on the street-facing doors simultaneously with a feint at the loading dock to split their attention." Ren looked up. "Which works, but it costs us the element of surprise on the primary entry because the loading dock feint has to be loud enough to pull focus. How loud? Adrian said. Loud enough that they're looking at the water when we come through the doors. Adrian looked at the map for a long moment. He looked at the reinforced interior rooms that Celine had described, centrally located based on the original floor plan, which put them as far from every exterior wall as the building's dimensions allowed. Smart placement. The kind of placement that said whoever had designed the operational layout of this building had done it with a specific purpose in mind and had taken the time to do it right. She's in the center, he said. Most likely, Wren said. Maximum distance from any breach point. Maximum reaction time for them if we come through the walls. Which means we need to move fast from the entry point to the interior. No clearing room by room. Straight to the center. Establish control of the holding area first, then expand outward. Marcus crossed his arms. That's aggressive. We'd be leaving uncleared space behind us. We'd also be reaching her before they have time to make a decision about her, Adrian said. He straightened up from the desk. We have 8 men plus ourselves. I want 4 on the primary breach, 2 on the secondary approach as containment, and 2 positioned at the dock as the feint team. He paused. I'm going through the primary with the first 4. Marcus looked at him. Not with surprise. Marcus had stopped being surprised by Adrian's decisions years ago, but with the careful attention of a man calibrating how hard to push back. Sir, I'm going through the primary, Adrian said again. Not louder. Just final. Marcus closed his mouth. Celine was in the corner of the room, having absorbed the entire briefing without speaking. She spoke now. The transit routes. You said you needed them. What do you have? She came to the desk and looked at the map. She was quiet for a moment, studying the street grid around the waterfront building, and then she pointed. Piers would use one of 2 options if he moved her. The loading dock access to a water transit. There's a channel behind the building, tidal, navigable at night. Or the service road on the north side that connects to the freight corridor. There's a truck depot 2 blocks north that he has access to. She looked up. Those are his patterns. He doesn't improvise. He uses infrastructure he's already confirmed. It is so we seal the channel and the freight corridor. If you can do it without triggering their perimeter surveillance. Adrian looked at Wren. Can we? If we position before full dark, once they have active watchers on post, placing people near the channel will register. Wren checked his watch. We have about 2 hours before dark. We move 2 men to the channel now, 2 to the freight corridor, and they hold position quietly until the breach team initiates. Then that's what we do. Adrian picked up his jacket. We move in 2 hours. The next 2 hours were the particular kind of controlled chaos that looks like calm from the outside. Men checked weapons, loaded vehicles, communicated in the clipped shorthand of people who have worked together long enough to compress full sentences into single words or gestures. Adrian changed into dark clothing, not tactical gear, nothing that would read as military from a distance, just dark pants, dark shirt, the kind of unremarkable dark that lets you move through a city at night without generating the specific silhouette of a man who is about to do something violent. He went to the office alone for 7 minutes before they left. He stood at the desk and looked at the legal pad where he'd written Vivian's name that morning. He had filled 6 pages since then. He tore the page with her name off the pad and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket, which was not something he could have explained to anyone and didn't try to. He called no one. He left no message. He walked out of the office and went downstairs and got into the lead vehicle. The waterfront district at night was the kind of dark that cities manufacture in their industrial zones. Not the natural dark of absence, but the deliberate dark of spaces that have chosen not to be seen. Sodium lights at long intervals. Chain link topped with wire. The smell of brine and diesel and the particular rot that comes from water sitting against old concrete for decades. Adrian's team arrived in 3 vehicles from 3 different directions over a 15-minute window, parking at distances that looked incidental. They assembled on foot in the shadow of the neighboring structure's eastern wall. 8 men. Adrian. Wren coordinating from a position 2 blocks back with a radio and the building's floor plan on a tablet. Nobody spoke above a murmur. Adrian put his back against the neighboring structure's wall and looked at the 40 feet of open ground between the building's eastern face and where he was standing. The exterior showed no modification over the original plans. Raw concrete, no windows at ground level, a rusted service door at the midpoint that was either sealed from the inside or accessible. The question that had been unanswerable from the outside was about to get answered. Marcus moved to his left shoulder. Faint team is in position at the dock, he said, barely above a breath. Containment is set at the channel and freight corridor. Adrian nodded. He looked at the service door and made the decision that had been building since the alley, since the kitchen counter, since the gravel shoulder on the Harwick stretch in the gray morning. He made it the way he made all his final decisions, completely, without remainder. Go, he said. The feint at the dock was not subtle. It was not designed to be. Two of his men at the waterside created the kind of disturbance that a perimeter watcher couldn't responsibly ignore. Engines, light, sound, the suggestion of a vehicle attempting the dock approach. It lasted approximately 20 seconds before it was designed to abort, but those 20 seconds were what Adrian was spending on the eastern wall. The service door was not sealed. It was locked with a standard commercial deadbolt that had been added externally, not part of the original structure, added by whoever had prepared this building for its current use. Marcus had the door open in 8 seconds with a tool that made no more sound than a key would have. They went in. The interior was dark and smelled of salt and old refrigerant from the building's cold storage past. The floor plan had been accurate. Open space immediately inside, a grid of structural columns extending toward the center, the ceiling high and lost in shadow. Somewhere ahead, the hum of a generator that Celine had described. And beyond that, visible as a faint line of light beneath a door at the building's center. A room that was occupied. They moved fast. Not running. Running makes noise. Running is panic. Moving with the specific speed of people who have done this before, who understand that velocity and silence are not opposites if you've trained enough, flowing between the columns with weapons up and eyes moving. The first guard was at the 9 o'clock position from the entry, sitting on a crate with his back to the eastern wall. He saw them at the same moment Marcus reached him, and he got one hand toward his radio before Marcus put him down without a sound. The man crumpled, and Marcus caught him and lowered him to the concrete, and they kept moving. The second guard was the problem. He was positioned directly in front of the central door, standing, not sitting, with a radio already in his hand. And he had heard something or felt something or simply had the professional instinct that makes certain men harder to approach. He turned at 10 feet and got the radio to his mouth before Adrian covered the distance and put him against the column and got a hand over the radio before the transmission went through. The struggle was brief and ugly and close. The kind of close-quarters physical exchange that is nothing like cinema, that is all elbows and weight and the hot smell of another person's exertion against your face. Adrian was larger and had the element of partial surprise. He ended it. His breathing was elevated when he straightened up. He registered that without judgment and brought it down deliberately, 2 long, controlled exhales, because what was behind that door was going to require him to be still. 3 of his men took positions covering the approaches. Marcus moved to the door. Adrian stood with his hand on the handle. From inside the room, no sound. He opened it. The room was approximately 20 feet square. Concrete walls. A cot against the far wall, a bucket, a single work light on a hook that threw yellow across everything. A woman sat on the cot with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, and her eyes, already open, already watching the door, because she had been listening to what was happening outside with the hyper-alert attention of someone who has nothing else to do. Her eyes found Adrian in the doorway, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Vivian looked like she had been through something. Her hair was matted, her face was pale in the work light's yellow. There was dried mud on her hands and her forearms from the forest floor, and her coat was torn at the hem where she'd caught the fence on the highway. She had a cut on her left cheekbone, shallow from when she'd fallen in the woods, and it had scabbed over dark. She looked like she had been through something, and she was still completely upright. She stared at him. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. "You came," she said. "Just that." "I came," Adrian said. He moved into the room. She uncurled from the cot and stood, carefully, the way you stand when you've been sitting in cold for too long and your muscles have locked. And he reached her and put his hands on her face and looked at her, and then pulled her against him. And she let him, and he held her with his arms fully around her and his face in her hair. And he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was adequate. And he had the self-awareness to know it. She had her fists in his shirt. She was shaking, from cold, from adrenaline, from some combination that she was probably not going to be able to sort out for weeks. She did not cry. She had apparently made some decision in that room about crying that she was holding to even now. After 4 seconds, he released her. There was no time for more. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "We need to move. Right now." "I know." She looked at him with the direct attention she'd always had. The thing about Vivian that had drawn him to her in the first place, and that he had subsequently done everything possible to waste. And she said, "Is there more of them?" "Yes." "Then let's go." He put her behind him and they moved toward the door. And that was when the radio on the guard Marcus had taken down by the column crackled to life. The static burst of someone on the other end trying to reach a position that wasn't responding. One burst. Two. Then Piers's voice, recognizable even through the radio's compression, saying a single word with the clipped authority of a man who has pre-planned for this scenario. Move. Every light in the building went out. The generator had not stopped. Adrian could still hear it through the wall. But whatever had powered the building's interior circuit was severed deliberately, instantly, plunging the entire space into the specific blindness of a sealed interior with no natural light. The work light in the room went dark. The faint glow from the dock side that had been visible through the high windows disappeared. From across the building, in the dark, he heard footsteps. Multiple, moving fast. "Flashlights," Adrian said, and his voice was level even now, and the men responded within 2 seconds, beams cutting across the open space, and in the sweeping light Adrian saw what was happening. 3, 4 men emerging from a secondary interior space he hadn't identified in the floor plan. A room behind the holding room that the Port Authority plans had marked as decommissioned refrigeration, which it apparently was not. Celine had said 12, maybe 15. He could see 8 in the first 3 seconds. "Marcus, left flank. Take 2 men. Hold the column line." "Sir." "Go." The next 90 seconds were the kind of time that expands and compresses simultaneously. That elastic quality of violence where individual moments crystallize with complete clarity while the sequence around them blurs. Adrian kept Vivian behind him with one hand pressed back against her sternum as they moved toward the eastern exit, and he used the other hand for what the situation required. And the sounds the building made during those 90 seconds were not the sounds of a clean operation, but of a close and brutal and insufficiently planned engagement with people who had prepared for exactly this. He took a hit on the left shoulder. Not a bullet, a strike from something blunt in the dark, a man who came from the wrong angle at the wrong moment. The impact drove him sideways into a column, and he felt something in his shoulder object loudly, but not in the way that stops you, just in the way that narrows your attention down to a single bright point of pain that you acknowledge and set aside because setting it aside is the only available option. He set it aside. They made the eastern door. 4 of his men accounted for, 2 still somewhere in the dark interior, positions unknown. He couldn't wait. He pushed Vivian through the door into the cold air of the alley and turned and held the door until Marcus came through with 1 man behind him, and then he let it go and they moved. The alley behind the building connected to the service road. They were 40 feet down it, Vivian moving faster than he would have expected given everything, when Wren's voice came through the earpiece. "Boss, channel side. They've got a boat." Adrian stopped. "Is it moving?" "Not yet. 3 men, loading. I see a case. Equipment case. Big." "The documentation," Celine's voice. She was still with Wren, still 2 blocks back, and she came through the radio with an urgency that was different from anything he'd heard from her before. "Adrian, Piers is at the channel. He came personally." Marcus grabbed Adrian's arm. "We have her. We walk. We're done." Adrian looked at Vivian. She was breathing hard, her hand on the alley wall for balance, watching him with those direct eyes. "Go," she said. "Vivian, I heard. Piers is at the channel." She straightened up from the wall. "Go, Adrian, end it." He looked at her for 1 second, 1 full second, the length of a breath, the length of a decision. He looked at Marcus. "Get her to the vehicle. Don't stop. Don't wait. Drive." He looked at Vivian 1 more time. "Don't forgive me yet." She almost said something. He turned before she could. He ran. The channel was behind the building's loading dock, accessible through a narrow passage between the dock structure and the neighboring property's retaining wall. Tight, unlit, the kind of approach that punished width and rewarded speed. Adrian hit it at a run and came out on the channel side to find exactly what Wren had described. A low-profile boat against the dock, 3 men working quickly under handheld lights, and at the center of the activity, standing with his back to the building and his face toward the channel water, a man Adrian had never met in person, but whose photograph he had looked at enough times to recognize immediately. Piers Voss was shorter than Adrian had expected. Compact, dark-haired, in his late 30s with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had been made angular by the years since. He was wearing a heavy jacket against the waterfront cold. He was not holding a weapon. He turned when Adrian hit the dock planking and looked at him with an expression that was, impossibly, calm. Faster than I expected, Piers said. The three men by the boat had all turned, all armed. Two of them were bringing weapons up, and Adrian's own weapon was already leveled. The geometry of the situation was one he had been in before, the specific arithmetic of a man alone against multiple armed people in an open space. And the arithmetic was not favorable, but it was not impossible if the man alone was precise and fast and absolutely willing. Tell them to hold, Adrian said. Why would I do that? Because I'm going to give you the choice before I stop giving choices. Piers tilted his head. Behind him, the channel water moved darkly, and the boat rocked gently against the dock, and one of the armed men, the one on Adrian's right, the more dangerous angle, shifted his weight forward. Adrian shifted his aim. My wife is out of the building, Adrian said. His voice was completely steady despite the pain hammering through his left shoulder with every heartbeat. Your inside man is in my custody. Your primary location is burned. The freight corridor and the channel are both covered. He paused. Whatever you thought you had at the beginning of tonight, you don't have it anymore. Piers looked at him. The calm on his face did not break. It was genuine calm, which was more unsettling than performance, because genuine calm in this moment meant this man had already accepted an outcome that Adrian hadn't fully mapped yet. You're right, Piers said. I've lost the structural advantage. He took a single step toward Adrian across the dock planking. The two armed men held position, not because of Adrian's weapon, but because Piers hadn't given them the signal. But I want to ask you something man to man before this concludes. No. Do you know what my father said? I said no. Adrian's voice was hard as iron. I'm not standing here while you eulogize. You had her in a concrete room. You threatened my unborn child. We don't have a conversation that puts a frame around that. Piers stopped moving. Something shifted in his face. Not the calm breaking, but a thread of something else appearing beneath it. Something that had been there since the beginning of the evening, maybe since the beginning of the 2 years he'd spent building this, and that was now encountering the limit of what planning can provide when the plan has come apart. You took everything, Piers said. His voice was still controlled, but thinner now. You took my father, my family's work, our name. You handed it to men who had made the same kind of deals you make every day, and you called it justice. The man on Adrian's right moved. Not a full lunge, a shift, a repositioning. The preliminary motion of a man who has been given a signal Adrian hadn't seen Piers give, some micro gesture Adrian had missed, and in the fraction of a second where that motion registered, Adrian made the calculation that the situation had been making itself toward since the moment Piers turned around on this dock. He fired. The shot hit the man on the right in the shoulder, and he went down sideways against the boat, and the second armed man fired almost simultaneously. The shot going wide, punching into the dock structure behind Adrian because the man was not as fast as he needed to be, and Adrian was already moving, dropping to one knee on the dock planking, which saved his life, because the shot passed through the space his chest had just vacated. One of his men, the containment position on the channel, Adrian had forgotten they were close enough, came through the passage behind him, and the engagement on the dock became something different. No longer a man alone against three, but a split engagement with the arithmetic suddenly revised. Piers ran. He went for the boat. He was fast, faster than his compact build suggested, the speed of a man who has planned his exit route and knows every step of it. He cleared the dock edge and hit the boat's deck and reached for something, a control panel, the ignition, and for 2 seconds, he was going to make it. Adrian crossed the dock at a full run with his left shoulder screaming, and his vision narrowed to a tunnel, and he reached the boat's edge as the engine caught and threw himself onto the deck, and the impact was not graceful. It was the impact of a large man landing badly on a moving surface, one hand catching the gunwale, one knee hitting the deck, the pain in his shoulder going from loud to deafening. Piers turned from the control panel. He had a weapon now, drawn from somewhere in the jacket, and they were close, too close for either of them to use it cleanly, and they both knew it, and they were close enough that Adrian could see his face with complete clarity in the dark. The boat was moving, pulling away from the dock with the two of them on it, and the dock receding behind them and the channel water opening up ahead, black and cold and deep, and Adrian's men on the dock could not follow and could not safely fire without hitting him, and Piers knew all of this. End of choices, Piers said. His hand tightened on the weapon. Adrian looked at him across 18 inches of rocking deck with his left arm not fully responding, and his lungs burning from the run and the shoulder and the dock impact, and he looked at Piers Voss with the complete attention of a man who has reduced the entirety of a situation to a single point, and he said nothing at all. Because there was nothing to say. There was only what happened next. The boat hit the channel's center current and lurched. The lurch was small, a natural shift in the water's flow where the channel met the deeper basin. But on a moving deck with two men already off balance, it was enough. Piers's weapon arm swung wide for a half-second, tracking the motion involuntarily, and Adrian moved into that half-second the way he had learned to move into every gap that presented itself in his life. Without hesitation, without deliberation, with the complete commitment of a man who understands that hesitation is just a slower way of losing. He got his right hand on Piers's weapon arm at the wrist. Not a grab, a clamp, the kind of grip that comes from the forearm and not the fingers. The kind that doesn't shake loose because it isn't built from tension, but from the complete closing of a hand around something it has decided not to release. Piers pulled back. He was strong, compact strength, the dense functional strength of someone who had spent 2 years preparing for something. And for 3 seconds, they were locked on the rocking deck of a boat, moving through dark water with neither of them able to resolve the geometry. Then Piers drove his elbow back into Adrian's left shoulder. The pain was extraordinary. It went through him like electrical current, from the shoulder through the neck and down the left side of his back and into his hand, which opened involuntarily, just for a fraction of a second. But a fraction of a second was sufficient. Piers broke free and swung. Adrian got his head down and the weapon's frame connected with his cheekbone instead of his temple, which was the difference between down and dead. And the impact split the skin above his cheekbone, and the blood came immediately, the way face wounds do. He went down on one knee. Piers stepped back and leveled the weapon, and Adrian looked up at him from one knee on the wet deck with blood running down his face, and his left arm hanging at an angle that suggested the shoulder had finally run out of patience. And in that moment, that specific, suspended, terminal moment, he did not think about tactics or geometry or the arithmetic of the situation. He thought about Vivian on a cot in a concrete room with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes open in the dark, counting her breaths. He thought about an ultrasound photo in a coat pocket, carried through a storm to a gate that didn't open. He thought about 14 unanswered calls. Piers's face in the boat's low wash of instrument light was not triumphant. That was the unexpected thing. It was tired, deeply, profoundly tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the past hour, and everything to do with 2 years of building toward a night that had now arrived and was not delivering what had been promised. Revenge has a particular poverty to it that you cannot see from the planning stage. Piers was seeing it now, in real time, and it was changing his face. You could have just paid, Piers said. His breathing was elevated. Farr's documents. That's all it would have taken. 2 years of work, and all it required was one document transfer. And then you would have found another lever, Adrian said. That's how this works. You know that. Piers looked at him. My father died in a federal facility. Did you know that? Not from violence, from neglect. He had a cardiac condition that the facility's medical staff documented and did not treat. He died in a room alone. He paused. That is what your information purchased. Adrian said nothing. He held Piers's gaze, and he did not look away. And he did not offer the absolution of a response that might sound like an apology, because an apology would have been the worst kind of lie he could have told on this deck. I know, he said instead. Just that. 2 words, carrying exactly their weight and no more. Piers stared at him. Something moved behind his eyes. The internal machinery of a man running out of road, checking the available routes, finding them narrowed to one. His weapon arm had been rock steady for 30 seconds and was now, very slightly, not. Not from fear. From the exhaustion of holding a position that gravity has been working against the whole time. The channel water ran black around them. Somewhere behind the boat, the dock lights were visible as distant orange smears. It's done, Adrian said. His voice was quiet. Not gentle. He didn't have gentle in him tonight, maybe didn't have it in him generally, but without the hardness that had characterized every word he'd spoken since the Harwick stretch. Your people are down. Your location is burned. Celine is in my custody, and she's told me everything. There's no architecture left. He kept his eyes on Piers. Shoot me or don't, but either way, tonight is finished. Piers breathed. Long, slow, the breath of a man at the end of something. Then he lowered the weapon. Not all the way. Not a surrender, not a dropping of arms. Just a lowering, the muzzle angling toward the deck. And in the night air above the black channel water, that partial lowering meant more than a full dramatic gesture would have. It meant he was tired. It meant the machinery had stopped. Adrian got to his feet. Slowly, using his right arm for the push, his left arm still registering its objection loudly. He stood on the rocking deck and faced Piers and reached out his right hand, not for the weapon but for the control panel behind Piers, and he cut the engine. The boat drifted. They stood on a drifting boat in a dark channel and looked at each other, and the water moved around them. And somewhere in the city behind them there were sirens beginning, distant, the slow arrival of a world that had been notified something had happened here. "You're going to go to prison," Adrian said. "The same place your father went. I won't pretend that doesn't have a particular ugliness to it." Piers said nothing. "But your sister isn't going with you." Adrian watched Piers' face when he said it. "That's the deal. Celine walks. Whatever she was when she came into my house, what she did tonight ends differently." He paused. "She told me about the pregnancy. She drew the line. That matters." Piers looked away from him for the first time, out across the channel water, toward the distant lights of the city's far bank. His jaw worked. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "She was always the better of us." Adrian said nothing. He took out his phone and called Marcus. The police presence on the waterfront was managed by people whose numbers Adrian had maintained for exactly these intersections, the places where his world and the legitimate world overlapped and required brokering. Piers was taken off the boat at the channel's east bank by men in plainclothes who produced credentials when the first uniformed units arrived, and the conversation that followed was the kind of conversation that happens in the institutional gaps of every city, quiet and efficient and unrecorded. Adrian stood on the bank with his shoulder and his cheekbone and watched it happen. When Marcus appeared at his elbow with a first aid kit that he had apparently produced from a vehicle like it was the most natural thing in the world to carry, Adrian sat on a concrete abutment and let Marcus work on the cheekbone without speaking. The shoulder was going to require a doctor. The cheekbone required tape and pressure. Marcus applied both with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before. "The two men inside," Adrian said, "both accounted for. Reyes took a round in the vest, bruised ribs, nothing structural. Carr got his hand stepped on during the blackout. He's annoyed about it. Vivian. Vehicle is 3 blocks south. She refused to go further." Of course she did. Adrian almost said it out loud, but didn't. He stood up and pressed the gauze Marcus had taped to his face and walked south. The vehicle was a black SUV parked in the shadow between 2 sodium lights. He could see Vivian through the window before he reached the door, sitting in the back seat with a thermal blanket around her shoulders that someone had thought to keep in the vehicle, looking out the window at the waterfront with an expression he couldn't read at distance. He opened the door, and she turned to look at him, and her eyes went immediately to the taped cheekbone and the way he was holding his left arm. "How bad?" she said. "Shoulder. Needs looked at." "Sit down." He sat in the seat beside her and pulled the door shut, and the interior of the vehicle was warm, and it smelled like the thermal blanket and faintly like the rain that had still been damp in Vivian's hair. And the contrast with everything outside was so complete that for a moment he simply sat in it. Vivian looked at him. He looked at her. The cut on her cheekbone, the mud still in the creases of her hands, the way she was holding herself. Not fragile, nothing like fragile, but with a carefulness that spoke of someone who has done a precise inventory of their body and knows exactly what it has been through. "Piers," she said. "Handled." She absorbed that. "The baby," she said. "He knew about the pregnancy. His people, they didn't hurt you, either of you." "No." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I didn't tell them about the baby. They found the photo, but I didn't confirm anything. I didn't give them—" She stopped, took a breath. "I didn't want them to have it. That information. It felt like the one thing I could still protect." Adrian looked at her hands in her lap. He looked at them for a moment, and then he put his right hand over them, both of her hands, and he didn't say anything. She didn't pull away. They sat like that for a while. Outside, the waterfront continued its slow reorganization. Vehicles moving, men dispersing, the machinery of cleanup operating in the dark with the practiced invisibility that Adrian's world had always depended on. Inside the vehicle, none of that existed. There was just the warmth and the thermal blanket and 2 people on the other side of a night that had cost more than either of them had been prepared to pay. "I listened to your calls," Adrian said. Vivian was still. "The log on your phone, 14 calls. I looked at every timestamp." He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at their hands. "I saw your name on the screen that night, every time." She was very quiet. the particular quiet of someone who has been carrying something for hours and is now setting it down carefully, not sure what shape it will hold once it's no longer being gripped. "What were you going to say?" he said, if I had answered, the first time. She thought about it. He could feel it, the thinking, the selecting, the arriving at honesty after consideration of several other options. "I was going to tell you about the baby," she said, "and then I was going to tell you that I was done, that I was leaving." She paused, that I had been standing at a gate that was closed to me for years, and I was done waiting for it to open. He absorbed that. He absorbed every word of it the way you absorb something that is both true and deserved and exactly as painful as it should be. "Were you," he said, "still going to leave, after telling me?" "Yes." She said it clearly, not with anger. The anger had been burned through somewhere in that concrete room, left behind with the cold and the dark. "I wasn't coming to save the marriage. I was coming because you had a right to know about your child before I left." And now, she turned her head and looked at him. He was still looking at their hands. "Now I'm in a car on a waterfront at 2 a.m. with a thermal blanket, and my husband has tape on his face and we're both alive, which, as of about 4 hours ago, was not something I would have put money on." She paused. "I don't know what now is. That's honest. I'm done being anything else." He looked up at her then. He looked at her directly, which was something he had also been doing less of than he'd realized. Looking at her directly, without the avoidance that had built itself into the architecture of their daily life so gradually that he hadn't noticed it becoming the architecture. She looked back at him. The work light's ghost was still in her eyes somehow. That particular alertness of someone who had been alone in the dark for a long time and had decided to stay awake. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me tonight," he said. "I'm not going to ask you for anything tonight." She held his gaze. "Good, but I need you to know that I understand what I did. Not what happened tonight, before tonight. The 14 calls they're a symptom. The gate order is a symptom." He paused, finding his way through it with the same care she'd used finding her words. "I built something that required me to be a specific kind of man, and I let that man crowd out every other version of myself until there was nothing left inside the house that was worth coming home to. And you came anyway. For 8 weeks you carried something that should have been the most important thing in my life, and you drove through a storm to tell me, and I—" He stopped. His voice had not broken. It had not risen. But it had arrived at a place where continuing would have required him to push through something that he decided, for once, not to push through. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. She turned her hand over under his so that her palm was facing up, and she held his hand. Not squeezing, just holding, the way you hold something you haven't decided about yet but aren't ready to put down. "Drive us to the hospital," she said. He looked at her. "The baby needs to be checked. You need your shoulder looked at." She said it with the practical steadiness of someone who has located the next necessary step and is going to take it regardless of everything surrounding it. "We can figure out the rest after." He nodded. He reached forward and knocked on the partition and told the driver where to go, and the vehicle pulled away from the waterfront and into the city's nighttime streets, and Vivian leaned her head back against the seat with the thermal blanket around her shoulders and closed her eyes, not from exhaustion, but from the specific relief of motion, of being in something that was moving forward, away from the place it had been. Adrian watched the city move past the window. The streets were quiet at this hour, the sodium lights making orange pools on wet asphalt, the buildings dark except for the scattered windows of people who worked at night or couldn't sleep. An ordinary city doing its ordinary late-night existence, indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. He thought about what came next. Not strategically. He would do that, eventually. There was significant wreckage to sort through. Danny Reese, the operational exposure, the Voss network's remaining fragments, the federal implications of the FAR demand having been made at all. He would build the list and work through it with the methodical patience that had built everything he had. That was coming. But tonight, in this vehicle, what he thought about was simpler. He thought about the ultrasound photo. It was still in the evidence bag at the estate, logged, tagged, handled by men with gloves. He was going to get it back. He was going to take it out of the bag and unfold it and look at it properly, the way it should have been looked at in the first place, in a warm room without the machinery of consequence running in the background. He was going to do that, and it was going to be one of the most difficult things he had done in a life that had not been short on difficulty, because it would require him to sit with the full weight of what that image represented without performing any of the stoicism that had served him everywhere else. He was going to do it anyway. The hospital's emergency entrance was lit up white and clinical, and the driver pulled under the overhang and Vivian opened her door before anyone could open it for her, which was entirely consistent with everything Adrian had relearned about her in the past several hours. She stood on the concrete with the thermal blanket still around her shoulders and looked at the entrance and then looked back at him as he came around the vehicle. "They're going to ask questions," she said, "about the cut on your face, the shoulder. I'll manage it. I know you will." She said it without irony, without the edge that it might have carried a day ago. Just acknowledgement. He managed things. That had always been true. "I'm going to tell them the truth about how I spent the night. The cold, the fall, all of it. The stress." She paused. "I'm not going to lie to protect—" "Don't," he said. "Tell them everything, all of it." She looked at him, reassessing. The way you look at a familiar object that has revealed an unfamiliar angle. "Okay," she said. They walked into the hospital together. Not arm in arm, not with the performed closeness of people trying to project unity. Just side by side. Two people who had both been through something and were both still standing, walking through automatic doors into fluorescent light and the institutional smell of a place that existed specifically for the aftermath of things going wrong. The intake nurse looked up, looked at Adrian's face, looked at Vivian, asked the standard questions in the standard order. Vivian answered them. Adrian stood slightly behind her, his left arm still held carefully, and said nothing because she didn't need him to. They were separated into different examination areas. Vivian to obstetrics for monitoring, Adrian to a trauma bay for the shoulder, which turned out to have a partial separation that the attending physician addressed with the particular bedside manner of someone who has seen worse at this hour and isn't going to ask follow-up questions as long as the paperwork clears. It took 40 minutes, during which Adrian sat on a paper-covered examination table and stared at the wall and waited. Marcus texted twice. He replied to both with single words. Celine Voss was processed through a channel that would result in a conditional arrangement. Not freedom, not prosecution, but the institutional gray zone that Adrian's relationships made available in specific circumstances. It was not justice in any clean sense. It was what was available. He had told Marcus to make it happen, and Marcus had made it happen. And Adrian sat with the moral weight of that the way he had learned to sit with the moral weight of everything he'd done in 15 years of building an empire on the rubble of other people's structures. Squarely, without excuses, without the comfort of pretending it was something other than what it was. Danny Reese was a different calculation entirely. Danny Reese had a daughter named Harper who played soccer. Danny had made a choice that had nearly killed Vivian and the child she was carrying, and that choice had a cost that was real and non-negotiable. But the architecture of that choice, the 4 hours Harper had spent in unknown hands, the threat that had been held over Danny's head for however long they'd been running him, that architecture was also real, and Adrian was not a man who dealt in simple accounting when the variables were human. He would figure out Danny Reese. Not tonight, but he would figure it out with the full picture in front of him, which was more than he had afforded a lot of people. An hour and 20 minutes after they had arrived, a nurse led him down a corridor to a room where Vivian was sitting upright in a bed with monitoring equipment and an IV line delivering fluids and a color in her face that was better than what the vehicle's interior light had shown. The attending had already been in. The findings were what the attending had described to Adrian in a brief corridor conversation before he entered the room. Stress markers elevated but within manageable range. Fetal heartbeat confirmed. Strong, regular, no indication of compromise from the cold exposure or physical stress. The pregnancy was intact. Both of them were, to the extent that anything is intact after a night like this. Adrian sat in the chair beside the bed. Vivian was looking at the monitoring screen with the focused attention she gave to information she was processing. She looked at it for a moment longer and then she looked at him. "Strong heartbeat," she said. "I heard." The doctor said it like it was routine, like babies just hold on, through whatever. "They do?" Adrian said. He didn't know enough about it to know if that was true in general, but it was true tonight, in this room. And that was the scope of what he could speak to with any authority. Vivian looked at her hands in her lap. The mud was gone. Someone had given her a warm cloth at some point, and she had cleaned her hands with the thoroughness of a person who needed something specific to do. Her hands were her normal hands again, the hands he had held in a vehicle on a waterfront an hour ago. "I'm not going back to the estate," she said. "I know. Not immediately. Maybe not. I don't know the timeline, but I'm not walking back through that gate and resuming." She looked at him. "I need somewhere that's mine, while we figure out what's next." I have a property on the north side, small. Nobody knows it's connected to me. He paused. It's safe. More importantly, it's separate. You'd have it completely. I wouldn't come unless you asked. She considered it. The considering was genuine. He could see her working through it, testing it against her requirements. I'd have full access, the keys. I could leave when I wanted. Yes. And you'd actually stay away unless I asked. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment that had the quality of a measurement, the kind of look that is taking an accurate reading of something and will not be satisfied by performance. Okay, she said. The word was small, and it was not a resolution. It was not forgiveness or reunion or the beginning of something repaired. It was an okay, a provisional, careful, open-handed okay that was asking for nothing except the space it described. And Adrian received it for exactly what it was, without trying to expand it into something it wasn't. There's something I need to tell you, he said, about the whole operation, the Voss network, Danny, Celine, all of it, the full picture, he paused. You have a right to know the world you've been living inside. I've kept it from you because I told myself it protected you. It didn't protect you. It just kept you from being able to make informed choices. Vivian was quiet, I'll tell you everything, he said. Not tonight. When you're ready and when we're somewhere that isn't a hospital room. But I want you to know it's coming, that I'm not going to manage what you know anymore. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the monitoring equipment beeped twice in the background and a nurse checked the doorway and left again. Who are you, she said, when you're not running something? The question was not rhetorical, it was not cruel. It was the most genuinely curious thing she had asked him in years, and it landed with the specific weight of a question that the person asking it actually wants answered. He thought about it. Seriously, without deflecting into performance or deflecting into darkness. I don't fully know, he said. That's an honest answer. She nodded, slowly. Then that's what we figure out. Not together, not necessarily, but possibly. Eventually. The word we do in careful, modest, non-committal work in that sentence, carrying exactly as much as it could hold without breaking under the weight of what still needed to happen first. He stayed in the chair beside the bed until she fell asleep, which happened gradually over the next 30 minutes, her body finally processing the demand note that the night had delivered. He watched her breathe. He watched the monitoring equipment mark the two of them, her and the child that had been carried through a storm in a coat pocket and held on a concrete floor in the dark, and was still, impossibly, stubbornly, there. He sat in the chair, and he did not reach for his phone. He did not make calls or send messages or begin the operational reconstruction that was waiting for him on the other side of this room. He sat with his bad shoulder and his taped cheekbone, and he watched his wife sleep, and he stayed there the entire remaining hours of the night. Not because it was a gesture, and not because it was penance, but because it was the first true thing he had done in a very long time. Simply being present in a room where someone needed him to be present, without agenda, without exit. The sun came up eventually. The way it always does, indifferently, incrementally, the light arriving not in a single moment, but in the gradual shift from dark to gray to the thin, clean gold of a morning after a storm. Adrian was still in the chair when Vivian opened her eyes. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and in that moment the distance between them was exactly what it was. Real, earned, the specific distance of two people who had damaged something and were standing on either side of the damage, not pretending it wasn't there, but not walking away from it either. You stayed, she said. I stayed. She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached over and pressed the call button for the nurse because there were practical things to attend to and a day to begin, and she was not a woman who deferred practical things. But before the nurse arrived, she looked at him one more time across the clinical light of the hospital room, and what was in her eyes was not forgiveness and not love, at least not the uncomplicated kind. It was something older and more durable than either of those. It was the look of someone who has decided, after full consideration, to continue. Not to forget, not to pretend, but to continue. That was enough. For now, it was enough. Outside, the city moved into its morning. The waterfront was already ordinary again. Dock workers, delivery routes, the forgetting that cities do efficiently because they have too much happening to hold on to any single night for long. The Harwick stretch looked like every other section of highway in pale morning light. The storm was 3 days behind the weather system by now, somewhere over the ocean, spent. And somewhere in the north side of the city, a small property sat waiting, keys not yet handed over, rooms not yet filled, holding the particular potential of a space that has not yet been decided about. The greatest distance Adrian Morrow had ever crossed was not the 40 feet of open ground to the waterfront building's eastern wall, and it was not the dock with a weapon at his face, and it was not the channel in the dark. It was the 12 inches between a hospital chair and a bed, crossed without drama, in the thin morning light, when he leaned forward and put his hand on the bed rail and stayed there, not asking for anything, not offering anything, except the simple, difficult, insufficient, and necessary fact of his presence. It was not enough to repair what had been broken, but it was where repair begins. And Vivian, eyes open in the morning light, let it be where they started.